Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, or whatever time you're watching this because it's online church. My name is Josh. We're so glad you joined us at Three Creeks Church, where our vision is to help people find and follow God. So wherever you are in your spiritual journey, we're so glad you joined us. It is only 1 week away from Easter. I don't know about you guys, but I am just so excited to get to celebrate the resurrected King. We are going to be meeting in person, and for those of you guys that are going to be joining, we are going to have a 9 a.m. and 10:45 service. There is a capacity that we need to meet, so if you are going to be joining, we just ask that you RSVP at threecreekschurch.com, and then we will also be posting it later in the afternoon as a podcast and a video for those of you guys who are going to be joining online. Us as a church meeting back in person means that we need a team to help make it happen. So if you feel so inclined and you would like to join, you can find all the information on the website at threecreekschurch.com. We're going to enter now into our time of giving. If you call Three Creeks Church your home, or you believe in the mission and vision to help people find and follow God, we would ask that you would support us financially, that we would be able to continue to bring the gospel to Gehenna. You can find all the information to do so on the screen. All right. Last week of Minor Prophets, Joel Trainer bringing it home. Let's go.
Well, hello, Three Creeks, and welcome back to week 4. My name is Joel Trainer. I get to be the pastor here, and we are in week 4 of Minor Prophets season 1. And we've gone through Hosea and Joel and Amos, and now today I'm taking us through Obadiah, Minor Prophet number 4. If you liked this enough, maybe we'll do season 2 and season 3 in some upcoming years. We'll get into Habakkuk and Malachi, the great Italian prophet. We'll get into a bunch of them maybe in the next couple years, but this closes our series this time. Today I'm getting into the book of Obadiah, one of the minor prophets. I've mentioned this a few times, but the only reason why they're minor is because they're shorter in length. They're not as long-winded as some of the other prophets, and so they just get called minor literally because they have less chapters, but they're not any less significant or any less important. They're also difficult to understand, which is why there's a good chance that you haven't read a lot of this. And if you've ever read Obadiah, maybe you don't know anything about him because what you read was tough to understand. I'd like to try to explain some of who he is and why he wrote today. Obadiah is the shortest book in the Old Testament, 21 verses. That's it. He got right to the point. He was also the first prophet to write. And unlike all the other prophets who wrote primarily to Israel or to Judah, God's people, Obadiah wrote to somebody else. He wrote to the Edomites. Now, when I say that, you probably don't know who the Edomites are, but actually you might. You may not know it, but you might know who they are. Let me take a walk down memory lane, bring you back to the Clarity series we did last fall, or maybe I'll shoot you all the way back to Sunday school when you heard about a guy named Father Abraham. Remember him, right? Abraham had a son named Isaac. Isaac married Rebekah, and they got pregnant with twins, Jacob and Esau, right? Now, if you remember in the Clarity series, or you know the lineage of Jesus, you know that all like David and Moses and Joshua, they all come from twin Jacob, but not twin Esau. Well, what happened to Esau? Long story short, Jacob was actually the younger of the two brothers, but he stole the birthright from his father, deceptively from Esau. Jacob went on to have 12 sons. One of them was Joseph, and then ended up being the father of the nation of Israel. But what happened to Esau? Well, in Genesis 25, if you read that story, God tells Rebekah, who is pregnant at the time with Jacob and Esau, this is what he tells her. The sons in your womb will become two nations. From the very beginning, the two nations will be rivals. One nation will be stronger than the other, and your older son will serve your younger son. Jacob is the father of Israel, and the other brother Esau becomes the father of another nation, the Edomites. See, I told you that you might know who they were, but you didn't know it yet. In Genesis chapter 36, verse 8, it literally says that Esau, also known as Edom, settled in the hill country of Seir. When Jacob stole the birthright from his brother Esau, they were not friends at that moment. They were not good brothers. Esau was ticked off. But over a long period of time, Esau came to forgive Jacob. But the descendants of Esau and the descendants of Jacob, they did not share the same warm feelings towards one another. They became enemies for centuries, nations at war against one another. When Israel came out of Egypt and they wanted to get to the promised land, they wanted to go through where the Edomites were living, and the Edomites said no. The Edomites opposed both Saul and David and Solomon. They joined other nations like the Moabites that hated Israel and fought against them. The Edomites never invited any of the Israelites to their birthday parties. There was significant animosity between these two nations. You see, the Israelites, they lived in the hill country, in the caves, in the cliffs, a constant nuisance to the people of God and the purposes of God, and God had something to say, and so he used Obadiah, the prophet, to say it. What I'd like you to do is take 2 or 3 minutes, it's really not very long, only 21 verses, and open your Bibles to the crispy white pages once again of Obadiah. And take a minute as a group and read Obadiah together. Then I'll come back afterwards and explain a little bit more of it to you. Well, I think if you're reading that and you're paying attention at all, you're like, God is not thrilled with Edom and what they have done. Let me take a moment to summarize what God says to them for you real quick. And then I want to spend the rest of our time focusing on really just 2 verses that describe the condition of Edom's hearts and the problem that God has with it. You see, when Babylon attacked and ransacked Jerusalem in 587 BC, Edom looked on and cheered. They hid up in their mountain dwellings and they cheered. And then after Jerusalem and other Israelite cities had been rampaged, they went down and gathered the spoils. They even ambushed Israelite refugees and handed them over to their enemies. Verses 12 through 14 describe what they did pretty well and how God feels about it. This is what God says in verse 12. You should not have gloated when they exiled your relatives to distant lands. You should not have rejoiced when the people of Judah suffered such misfortune. You should not have spoken arrogantly in that time of trouble. You should not have plundered the land of Israel when they were suffering such calamity. You should not have gloated over their destruction when they were suffering such calamity. You should not have seized their wealth when they were suffering such calamity. You should not have stood at the crossroads, killing those who tried to escape. You should not have captured the survivors and handed them over in their terrible time of trouble. You see, when Israel goes through this terrible time of trouble, of calamity, Edom looks on and cheers. They don't join their ancestors' brothers' descendants. Instead, they cheer at their destruction. They kick them while they're down. Not a good look for Edom and not a good way to get with God. What's going on in the hearts of these people that rejoice at the destruction of another person? You ever wonder, what's going on with somebody who rejoices at the destruction or the downfall of somebody else? Well, God describes the heart of Edom, and I want to spend the rest of our time focusing on these verses right here, verses 3 and 4 of Obadiah chapter 1. This is what God says. He says, you've been deceived by your own pride. Because you live in a rock fortress and you make your home high in the mountains, you say boastfully, who can ever reach us way up here? But even if you soar as high as eagles and bring your nest among the stars, I will bring you crashing down, says the Lord. Let me just ask you a question. What evil in the world do you hate the most? If you think about everything that is broken, that is painful, that is terrible, that in the world, what evil do you hate the most? Like, what bothers you at a deep level? What makes you sick when you think about it? What evil do you hate the most? Now, let me ask you another question. If you think about God and you think about everything that you know about him, you think about his character and the Bible and everything you've read, what do you think God hates the most? What do you think God hates the most? Like, what bothers him when he sees it, he's sick? What evil, what sin do you think God hates the most? If I look at the Bible and I consider everything that I know about God, I believe the sin that God hates the most is pride. And James, the brother of Jesus, quoted Solomon, who wrote the proverb that God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. To me, I read that and I go, God opposes the proud. He doesn't ignore the proud. He doesn't overlook the proud. He opposes the proud. All through the Bible, you see God's hatred towards pride. He says, I hate it. I won't tolerate it. That's how God feels about pride. And it's humbling for me to stand here today and admit to you that the sin that I struggle with the most is the one that I believe God hates the most. That I'm a very prideful person and God hates that the most. C.S. Lewis, one of my favorite writers, wrote about pride this way. He said, the essential vice, the utmost evil, is pride. Unchastity, anger, greed, drunkenness, and all that are mere flea bites in comparison. It was through pride that the devil became the devil. Pride leads to every other vice. It is the complete anti-God state of mind. The complete anti-God state of mind. God's charge against Edom is pride. He said, you've been deceived by your own pride. I will bring you crashing down. He goes on to list these different offenses, but they're all rooted in the pride of Edom. When I explain that, I'm just asking, does that get your attention? Does that make you perk up? Do you even care about what I just said about pride? Because for me, it gets my attention. Because here's why. If I were to stand here today and say that I've been having an affair, or I have an anger problem and sometimes I lash out and I hit my children, or I have a drinking problem and I get drunk 5 or 6 nights a week, you would immediately call for my resignation and I would be criminally prosecuted for those things. But 2 minutes ago, I told you that I struggle with pride, and my guess is that your response was like, yeah, well, we all do. And it just didn't hit that hard. You're like, yeah, well, pride's tough. And it's what God hates the most. And we almost write off pride as this sin that we'll just always have. But it's at the root of our worst moments. It's certainly at the root of the worst moment in Edom's history. It's pride. It's what God hates the most. God hates it when we position ourselves in our minds ahead of anybody else. You see, it was the pride of Edom that led them to their worst moments, and that's our pride that leads us into ours. Simple question, do you think that you're prideful? I hope you know that you are, but just in case you don't, I discovered this pride test. It's 10 questions that help decide whether or not we're prideful. Nobody else is keeping score for you. You get to keep score for yourself, but I would just like to ask you 10 questions. And if you have to say yes to some of these questions, that would be an indication that there's some pride in your life. I'll just be honest with you. This was a bloodbath for me. It was not fun or enjoyable for me to go through and to acknowledge the fact that pride wreaks havoc in my life. And all of my worst moments are because I'm a very prideful person. Let me just give it a shot with you. 10 questions. You keep score. Maybe count up the number of times that you have to say yes as I ask you these 10 questions. Question number 1, do you become jealous or critical when others succeed? Do you become jealous or critical when others succeed? This one immediately exposes me because in my role, I'm supposed to celebrate when other churches grow. I'm supposed to celebrate when other churches report that they have double-digit baptisms or 25 salvations, but in my heart, I immediately get either jealous or critical or skeptical. Like those people that said that they became Christians probably did it last week at another church or at camp when they were growing up. Like, do those even count? I just find myself being skeptical or critical, and I'm supposed to be happy, but instead I find myself going, well, what are they doing that I'm not doing? Let me just ask you, do you feel that way about anybody in your life, in your circles, in your job? When another teacher succeeds and gets a promotion ahead of you, do you feel jealous, critical, or excited for them? When another mom succeeds, how do you feel about that? Do you become jealous or critical? This happens a lot on social media. When you see somebody else's vacation or somebody else's kitchen or somebody else's kids, all of that comes from pride. All of it comes from pride. Number 2, do you find yourself being critical of people that you don't know? Politician, an athlete, you get to the point where you can verbally assault your TV, somebody that you've never met before. That comes from pride. That comes from thinking that you're smarter or better or wiser in some category than them. Do you find yourself talking negatively about people that you don't know? Number 3, do you get upset when people don't honor your achievements? I do. Like when I achieve something or win something or earn something, I really hope that people will ask me about it. And so sometimes I'll even find ways to work it into the conversation, hoping that it comes back to me. I do it in a humble way, right? Like I start off by saying like, hey, like, how'd your high school soccer team do your senior year? And I let you talk for 30 seconds and I go, well, we won state. Like that's a funny example from a long time ago. I certainly did that. And I'm sure that I do things like that now. I'll ask about somebody else's church because I want to talk about mine. Does anybody else get frustrated when people don't honor your achievements? Why would we be upset when people don't honor our achievements? Because in our minds, we want them to think as highly of us as we think of ourselves, and that's pride. Question number 4, do you always have to be right? Like, do you always have to be right? Is it possible that you're wrong 50% of the time or more? Or do you always have to be right? When you're talking about departure time for when you need to leave to get somewhere, do you always have to be right? When you're playing a board game, do you always have to be right? Like, in your life, like, do you always think you're right? If you're somebody that can't admit that you're wrong probably 50% of the time or more, then that comes from a place of pride and thinking that you're smarter or superior than somebody else in the way that you think. Question number 5, do you often have conflict with other people? If you look at your life, are there a number of unreconciled relationships? Do you find yourself in fights with people a lot? People in your family or people at your job? If that's true, I know that this is going to sound crazy, but the common denominator in that might not be them, but it might be you. And the reason that you might be the common denominator is pride. And if you think I'm wrong, well, of course you do, because you've always got to be right? You see how pride, it just works itself into all these different scenarios in our life. Question number 6, do you have patterns of lying? Or maybe let me ask it this way, are you prone to exaggerate? Just a little bit. Like, we go to the gym like 4 or 5 times a week. It's like, well, or do you ever talk to somebody, or you go, we've been trying to eat healthy. And it's like, oh yeah, like when did you guys start doing that? They're like, well, we're starting on Sunday. Like you're just prone to exaggerate like a little bit, doesn't seem to hurt anybody. Why do you do that? Because you want to seem a little bit more impressive than you actually are. And that absolutely comes from pride. I do it all the time. Number 7, do you have a pattern of entitlement? Or do you have a pattern of thankfulness? Like if you're the kind of person that you just think you deserve stuff. Like, I ordered it 2 days ago. Why isn't it here yet? If that's just kind of your general attitude, like, well, why is there traffic? Who built these roads? Like rather than just having this attitude where you go, Like I have breath in my lungs. That is a freaking miracle. That we have lungs and we get to breathe air. That is not pride. Having an attitude of entitlement that you deserve something comes from pride. Do you have a hard time saying that you're sorry? A quick apology when you're wrong, that's humble. A quick apology even when you might be right, that is remarkable humility. That is amazing. If you can't bring yourself to say sorry, say the words, I am sorry. If you can't do that, if you hope the conversation just kind of disappears and doesn't get brought up again so that you don't have to say sorry, it comes from pride. It comes from pride. Number 9, do you feel superior to other people? Do you feel smarter than them? Do you think, I feel this way all the time. Like if everybody just thought like me, like I could not get away with saying no to that question. Like, do you feel superior to others? If I said no, my wife would just laugh her head off because she gets full 100% Joel, right? She hears all my thoughts, and it's embarrassing that how superior I feel to other people. It's not true. It's like a la-la land that I live in, and it comes from pride. Number 10, this is an interesting one. Does somebody else's pride bother you? Does somebody else's pride bother you? If it does, it's a red flag that you too are a very prideful person. Because chances are you're looking at somebody else's vocal arrogance. They're boasting, they talk about themselves, and you keep to yourself. You would never say something about yourself quite like they do. That's pride. That's you thinking that you're better than them. And so in your mind, you've positioned yourself above them, and that's what God hates. He hates pride. If you're feeling a little bit defensive right now, that's probably pride. That's pride. It just weasels its way into the crevices of our hearts, of our life, and it manifests itself in the worst ways. All of our worst moments come from a place of pride. How'd you do? I'm pretty sure I was 11 for 10 on that test. Not good. And as a Christ follower, as somebody that wants to be a humble person, I described, God hates pride. I don't want to be prideful. In Philippians chapter 2, my favorite 11 verses in the Bible, it describes what God in humility did for us. It says that Jesus, Christ, left his throne in heaven. He's the King of Kings. He was at the right hand of God when God created the world. And Jesus Christ, he puts down his crown and he puts on a diaper. And he comes in human form to earth. When he comes down, people are like, hey, did you come to be the king? He says, no, I came to serve everybody and give my life as a ransom for people. The humility, it's the most true version of humility ever. That's my goal. That's my target. I'll never get there this side of heaven, but as a Christian, I want to become more like Jesus in the area of humility. I want to look at those 10 questions and go, all right, I got to be honest. And how do I, God, would you help me to not be so critical of other people? Would you help me to say sorry? Would you help me to not always feel like I got to be right? Like I want to grow in these areas of humility so I can be old, wise, wrinkly, and humble. Like I want to become that kind of person. That's the charge to the Christ follower, is that, if you scored, 10 for 10, just like I did, we don't have to stay there. By the power of God, we can grow in the area of humility and honor God by being humble. But what I want to say to some people who are watching, who maybe you're not a Christian, and you're like, Obadiah, Edom, pride, yeah, some of this stuff makes sense, but not all of it does. I want to read you one more thing that happens to the nation of Edom. You see, pride, all it does is it brings destruction. That's what Solomon wrote. Pride comes before destruction. And I want to read you one more thing that God wanted to make sure that Edom heard loud and clear. This is what he wrote. Because of the violence you did to your close relatives in Israel, You will be filled with shame and you will be destroyed forever. Now, I could have left this part out of the message, but I felt like God wanted me to say this. God says, Edom, I'm going to destroy you forever because of your pride. I will bring you crashing down. And God wasn't kidding. When the Edomites fought against Rome in 66 AD, we're talking 600 years after Obadiah wrote this, they were crushed by Rome and they've never been heard of again. And you hear that and you go, yikes, like that seems harsh. I think that's how much God hates pride. I think that's how much God hates a heart that is not willing to humble itself before him. That's how much God hates pride. Pride brings destruction. What keeps people from experiencing a relationship with God is pride. It's this feeling of like, I got this. I don't need God. I don't need forgiven for my sins. I don't need a relationship with God. I'm good. We put up this front. A lot of it's false pride. It's really laced in insecurity. But at the end of the day, it's pride. It's pride that would keep someone from God. And I'm just talking to the person who's watching this, who's never laid down their pride and given their life to Jesus. Jesus Christ in humility came and gave his life for you, and he asks you to do the same. To lay down your self-sufficiency, to lay down your pride, to lay down this attitude of like, if you've got it, and to humbly come before God and say, I need my sins to be forgiven. In that moment, you receive this God that's gracious and merciful and kind. God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. If you remain prideful and you go, I don't need God, God opposes you. And if you are humble and you say, I do need God, I do need God to save me, you receive grace. You receive forgiveness. It's all through the Bible. Exalt yourself, you will be humbled. Humble yourself, God will lift you up. God will exalt you. This is a kingdom. It's a kingdom of humility. In humility, to lay down your pride and give your life to God is the best move you could ever make in your life. Pride comes before destruction. Let Obadiah be a warning to you that it does not go well for the prideful, but the humble will be lifted up. I want to invite you to do that. If you're watching with a community group, then you should talk to your leader about that today as you discuss this message afterwards. If you're not watching this with a community group, but you're just watching or listening online, send us a note. Go to threecreekschurch.com and send us a note. We'd love to tell you more about what it means to follow Jesus. That's Minor Prophets Season 1. Maybe next year, we'll try Season 2. And for those of you that are comfortable in person, we'll see you next Sunday, Easter Sunday. Can't wait, 10:45 RSVP at threecreekschurch.com. If you're not comfortable to come in person yet, that's cool, man. Stay where you're at. Stay where you're at. We're going to post it, the video, the podcast. You can tune in. We want you to be able to follow God with us from your home. Three Creeks, I love you. We'll see you soon.
God's kingdom is a kingdom of humility. I'm so thankful that that is the family that we belong to. I hope that if you are checking out God for the first time, that you will join. I couldn't even imagine if it was the other way around and he celebrated the pride and that the humble were left out, but that is not the kingdom we belong to. Thank you for joining us for the Minor Prophets, and we will see you next week for Easter Sunday.